Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today. Please, we are streaming on am950radio.com, but of course, you can just turn on the radio and go to 950radio.com, am950radio.com, and of course, the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Please meet us there. Like and subscribe and click that bell so that whenever we come up live, you will be able to join us. And of course, please share the show, everybody. We're streaming on the Santita Jackson and Friends page on Facebook. That's the only page that you can join me on, the Santita Jackson and Friends page. I want you to meet me there. Become my friend there and like and share the show. Like and share the show. Many of you have expressed a lot of appreciation for the fact that, we've had to change things up a little bit because now you can see everybody, which is great, which is wonderful. And I'm glad about that. And of course, I'm on Twitter or should I say at Twitter. That is the Santita J. That is my handle there, at Santita J. We have got a tremendous panel to talk about voting rights in 2024. Voting rights in 2024. In this election, you don't really think about your voting rights until you go and you find that you've been purged from the rolls. You don't think about it until you don't have the access that you think that you have. But think about the people of New Bern, Alabama. Oh boy, oh boy. New Bern, Alabama. Wonderful southern hamlet, 80% black, 20% white. But there's something interesting that's been going on there. They have a black mayor, Patrick Braxton. Okay, you say that's not extraordinary. Well, this is extraordinary. What is extraordinary is that the white town folk will not allow him to perform his duties. They won't allow him to be the mayor that he was elected to be. And things are so bad in that town that most of the town folk didn't know that they could have elections because they haven't had elections in decades. So what do you make of that? And this is a 2024 story in The Guardian. I mean, this is something. They are suing to have Mayor Braxton perform his duties, to give him the power to do that. And so when we say to President Biden, look, we need an executive order protecting our voting rights, it's not something that we're pulling out of the sky. These are issues that are very, very real. When they got at the section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which really essentially said you had to have areas that have historically discriminated against Black people and people who've been disadvantaged, you need to be pretty clear about the Justice Department, so that we can make sure, so that we can oversee what you're doing. Well, when Chief Justice Roberts said, look, this is not the America of the 60s and the 50s and of Jim Crow and of Reconstruction and of slavery. We've had a Black president. All is well. What do you think about that, Dwight McKee? From, of course, the senior advisor to Dr. Cornel West in his presidential quest, in his presidential campaign. He's the dean of the Ma'afa Project. Of course, Republican strategist Joe Pinion. And we're going to start with you, the chairman of the Transformative Justice Coalition, one of the leading voting rights advocates in America today, Attorney Darrell Jones. When I saw this story, I thought of you. I mean, we could get 2 more Black congresspersons out of Alabama, which, given that the state is more than a quarter Black, yeah. So that's a good thing. But it's still a fight. It's still a fight. What do you make of what is going on in New Bern? What is that about? How do you, in 2024, how do you not have elections for decades, plural? How does that work, Darrell?
Well, Santita, until the present gentleman came along, Mayor Braxton, it was working well for them, because what they were doing is that in New Bern, and again, that's a town that was some 80% African American, 20% white, but the council that led them was predominantly white. And what they had been doing was that rather than holding elections, they were having secret elections. And so they would have the county council members that would elect themselves, reelect themselves. And then ultimately, once they reelected themselves, decided they needed a mayor, so they would appoint a mayor. And so what had happened back in 2020 was then Braxton decided, the black guy decided that he was going to run for this mayorship. Well, no one ran against him. No one filed against him. He did everything within his time frames. There was no opposition party that filed against him. And as it turned out, he, of course, was elected because he had no opposition. But then what the sitting members of that council did was that they went and they held a special election. But they didn't tell everybody there was a special election going on. And when they held the special election, they first elected themselves back to the city council, back to the New Bern County Council positions. And then they appointed their mayor, which was not Braxton, the mayor who had just put in and was unopposed, but went to the other, the white mayor that was there previously and appointed him. And so that's how they got to the point of being in a position where they have two mayors, one of which really went through the process, the other which had a special election that should not have occurred. So as a result of all of that, and it's a very small town, but as a result of all of that, the Legal Defense Fund now has become filed suit against the town and against the election and the process that they went in keeping Braxton out of the mayor's position. So that's what's happening in New Bern. And the situation in New Bern certainly lifts up why we need to have a Voting Rights Act, why it's important that, in various avenues of the Voting Rights Act that says that who can enforce the Voting Rights Act. All of this stuff now is being debated across the country. But New Bern certainly is the paper child, it is the poster child for the reason that the Voting Rights Act is so important. They hadn't been holding elections for their county council folks in two decades or so in New Bern. So this is what happens when things are done in the darkness and are not brought to light. The LDF and their filing now is bringing this to light. So people are realizing this. We were on top of this in 2020 when we first realized that it had happened, and sort of monitoring the progress that Braxton was making as he was trying to be instated as the rightful mayor of New Bern.
As the elected mayor.
The elected mayor, right, of Newark, because there was no opposition that filed against him. No opposition to either party. He should be the mayor. But the 20% of the white folks that were there were in control of the finances of New Bern, and they weren't about to allow the black mayor to take the seat and to start the process of spreading out the control, the power, and the wealth. And that's how we got to the position of where we are right now in New Bern with regards to that battle. And that's not to be, and let's remember, New Bern is maybe an hour and a half outside of Montgomery, Alabama, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a suburb, it's a smaller town, but it's also an epitome of what we saw happen in the state of Alabama when the state was told by the U.S. Supreme Court to put in place another minority congressional jurisdiction there, and the state refused to do it. And it ended up going to the Supreme Court. They said do it. The state legislator in Alabama still wouldn't do it, still resisted, and so we ended up having a federal judge that actually drew the map that ultimately became in place. That today that the elections are being held, or Tuesday the elections are being held in Alabama for that special district in that runoff election. So New Bern is just a condensed representation of what we've seen happen in other parts of Alabama, that racial resistance to power, that resistance to inclusion within the political realm. That's what we're seeing happen there, Santita.
Is that why Gerald Griggs, the president of the NAACP in Georgia, is saying there are many New Berns? They might not have had elections blocked, but you certainly, that is an attack upon your voting rights. If you can't have an election, he said, we still need pre-clearance. What would this executive order for our voting rights do? And what is Section 5? Why was the gutting of that so devastating?
Right. And what Brother Griggs is talking about with regards to the Section 5 and the pre-clearance is that was a provision within the Voting Rights Act. And what it required is that there were certain states that had a history of racial animosity and against voting rights for people of color. it would require them to have the clearance of the federal government before they could put in place policies, laws, restrictions with regards to individuals' rights to vote. And that was to be certain that the community of color, that their voting rights were protected, that there were no shenanigans going on that would, either on its face or in practice discriminate against the ability of African Americans and other people of color to be able to elect the individuals of their choosing and to have their collective voting power to be able to do it. So that's what Section 5 was all about, was being certain that it was sort of a sword and a shield, right? It was sort of the sword part of it being that it was protecting people from laws that were going to be coming at them to try to take their voting rights away from them. That's what Section 5 was all about, and that's what was gutted by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013 with the Shelby versus Holder decision, when they decided that racism no longer existed, therefore allow these states to do whatever they want to do. We don't have to worry about racism anymore. Everything's going to be just all right. And needless to say, within hours of the decision in that case, in the Shelby decision, North Carolina and several of the other states already had on the books, many passed immediately, legislation to make it more difficult for people to be able to vote, and almost, in one case, they would say with surgical precision in North Carolina, carving out to make it more difficult for African Americans to be able to elect people of their choosing, and thus diluting their voting power.
So where are we with the vote in 2024?
Well, that's an excellent question. Section 5 is still gone. The pre-clearance provision is still gone. The current Supreme Court now has before it a couple of cases. One dealing with what is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and that question, the question that's raised there is who has standing to bring cases of voting rights violations, and that comes out of Arkansas. And in that Arkansas NAACP case, what the court there, the Eighth Circuit, has said there is that individuals like the NAACP, organizations like the NAACP, Rainbow Push Coalition, Transformative Justice Coalition, Black Voters Matter, those organizations cannot bring lawsuits for violations of the Voting Rights Act. That an individual, an attorney, such as myself, a voting rights attorney, such as Barbara Arnwine, or any other, Mark Elias, any of them, none of us could bring an action for a known act of a violation of the Voting Rights Act on our own. The only entity that would be able to bring a case for a violation of voting acts would be the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney General. That's the only entity, the Department of Justice, only entity that would be able to do it. What does that mean? It means that as the Department of Justice decides whether or not something is merited to being brought forward, they would have that determination. It would swing with the administration. If you had an administration that didn't believe in Voting Rights Act and didn't believe in the enforcement, they didn't have to do anything. They wouldn't bring the cases forward. So all of this is still right now. This is the fight that we're in the middle of right now. There are 7 different states that are covered that are part of this Eighth Circuit decision. And we say that the people that live in those 7 states, they have fewer voting protections than the folks that are living in the rest of the states of the United States, because they can't bring violations of their voting rights before the court on their own. They are dependent upon the Department of Justice to bring those violations. And the sad part of all of this, Santita, is that when we talk about the Department of Justice bringing it, people would say, okay, the Department of Justice can bring it, I'll be safe. Over the last 20 years, of the number of cases that have been brought for violations of the Voting Rights Act, less than 10% have been brought by the Department of Justice. So it's not a protection that's going to be there. It's not something that you can really stake your claim to and say, I am protected. You're not protected. So all of this is what's happening as we speak with regards to voting and voting rights in the United States. And we haven't even talked about the pieces with regards to people being stricken and not knowing they've been removed from ballots, other measures that are being taken to not provide food and water to people in line for hours after they have reduced or closed polling places to intentionally create long lines. All of this is what's going on. So when we look at New Bern, right, New Bern is just an epitome of everything else that we see that's going on across this nation with regards to the fight for voting rights. And that's the reason that Gerald Graves says we needed an executive order to address all of this, to get all of this stuff straightened out right now.
At least for the duration of his presidency.
Exactly.
at the very least. Joe Pinion, Republican strategist. To me, this is a transpartisan issue. I mean, tell me what you think when you hear about New Bern, Alabama. 80% black, 20% white. You have a black mayor who was elected finally after decades of not having elections, and they won't let him be the mayor.
You go back to that old phrase, power concedes nothing without a demand. And I believe that not just on this issue, but on many issues, it's my opinion that Black people have been disempowered for so long that we have forgotten how to leverage power. We can have a serious conversation about the need for the Voters' Rights Act, and we can have a serious conversation about how the process of protecting vulnerable voters was in many ways upturned. But those protections have existed going all the way back to the 1960s, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000. And all during this period of time, the Black people who lived in this town were still being prevented from being able to vote for their own destiny and their own future because they were handing down elected positions as if they were a birthright. And so I do think that, yes, I think that there's a two-pronged conversation. I just think that we have to be careful about not allowing this one particular case to be subsumed by the greater and also pertinent issue of Black people not being allowed to vote, because it's also about Black people not being informed about what is happening locally. Black people not necessarily having people around them or having institutions that they're available to be able to figure out how do they remedy this faster than the 30 to 40 years when this has been occurring. So look, I think when I look at politics, as I've said before, I look at politics as a four-party nation trapped in a two-party system. You have to choose a side, but ultimately you have to look at things issue by issue. This is an issue where, with my own party, they are, I think, rightfully concerned about the accuracy of voter rolls, but they are equally dismissive about the access to the right to vote. And so we have to have a world where there is a confluence of concern for both of those issues, the accuracy of who is on the rolls, who has the ability to vote, but also in making sure that we have the access for those Americans trying to exercise their God-given and constitutional rights to be able to say, I can have the representation that I seek in the country that prides itself on having a democratic process.
Well, Joe, as you look at the accuracy of those who are on the rolls, and that's important. Are are Republicans not also concerned about the patterns that you see in which Black and brown people are pushed off the polls? With those of us who are Johnson, Washington, Jackson, I'm not taking that personally. Every other Black person is Jackson, Johnson, or Washington. But Rodriguez and Ruiz and on and on and on. I mean, because that is a pattern, and Lee and Lou, these are patterns that also exist right now. And so all across the country, people are being purged because we have these ancestral names, right? I mean, of course, I'm not saying that, this is not an African name, but, throughout history, we've had, since we've been here, we've been Washington, we've been Jackson, we've been Johnson. And if you have a John Johnson, and chances are you'll have many of them across the country, they all get purged.
Look, I think it goes without saying that Black people are disproportionately impacted by these purging of voter rolls. That's not a matter of opinion; it's just a statistical reality. So yes, I think that it would behoove the Republican Party to be interested in the disparate impact that these policies are having, because ultimately, whether the party wants to acknowledge it or not, we are moving towards a 21st century America where the coalition that has constituted the conservative movement has to evolve, has to change, and in some ways has to get back to a closer makeup to what the origins of the Republican Party look like, if there is any hope for the Republican Party and conservatism to survive. So yes, they should be concerned, but ultimately, again, when we get into this political trench warfare, unfortunately, all people seem to care about is winning. And this, I think I don't want to cheapen the argument, because I think I would like to keep the focus on the fact that we have to have stronger protections for voter rights, that if there's one American who wants to vote and being prevented from doing so, that it is a tragedy. But I think we also, in the context of having the conversation about how do we make sure that Black people are leveraging power effectively and efficiently, we need to be talking about the fact that the same people that are concerned about the gerrymandering when it comes to Black voters in Alabama are quite happy to basically take away that same leverage from Black voters when it suits them politically, because there has been a determination made that anything that is good for the Democratic Party is therefore good for Black people, even if in the interim it disenfranchises Black people. We've seen this in places like New York. We've seen this across the country. So I think ultimately all of this is solved by us fervently and vehemently demanding that we have protections in place, that we do a better job of informing our communities about when their rights have been violated, about figuring out what those legal remedies are. And I think Newkirk, to the point, is a place where you're seeing just history repeating in a way that many people just assumed was no longer a reality in America today.
Dwight McKee, does New Bern surprise you? What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think we need executive action, executive order. I think we need to declare order. I can't believe who Black people have become. To 80% of the town, they got a Black mayor. All he has to do is to appoint 20 of his friends as deputies and go and arrest the white folk. It's taking the rights away. I mean, we become impotent as a people. I could not imagine Dr. King and Jim Bevel and Jesse Jackson being in a town like that and not having closed it down. I watched thousands of white kids yesterday in the streets closing down the cities because somebody else's rights are being violated. But we seem to become impotent when it comes to protecting our own rights and fighting for ourselves. We've really become self-castrated. It amazes me who we have become as a people. And so they passed a law saying we can't bring water when somebody's on the line to give them water. Well, if everybody brings water, let everybody bring water and pass it out and let them come and arrest 1,000 people passing out water. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. So I don't really blame the white folk. You do what people let you do. I blame 80% of the Black folk in that town who have not seen themselves having the power to take 20% of white people out, which is 2 out of every 10 white people. You got 8% out of everybody in that town Black. And you were subservient to 20% of white people? Come on, y'all, give me a break.
How do you think that happens, Dwight? I mean, what happens?
I don't understand it, Santita. That's not who we were as a people. I think we may have gotten too dependent upon government and the Justice Department. We did everything we did growing in my day and your daddy's day. The laws working against us. It was illegal for us to vote. We got arrested if we went to the courthouse to vote. Yet we put people in the street and closed the bridges down and the courthouse down. And that's how we function as a people. We thought as a people, we were revolutionary in our thinking as a people. Now we become complacent and dependent upon these parties, on the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to free us. And it's not in their interest to free us. And so we become really our own worst enemies, in my opinion. It disgusts me. I can't believe it.
What's the way out?
Self-dignity, self-respect, understanding, as your daddy used to say, ain't nobody gonna free us but us, is that we need backbone. We need a different perspective. We need to become the people we once were, and somehow we lost that in the shuffle.
Well, you know, because I think of a Reverend C.T. Vivian getting beaten and bloodied. But he didn't back down off that.
Kept coming back for more. CT kept coming back for more.
Kept coming back for more. Dr. King, in the face of death and personal threats and whatever you say, he just kept on going until he go no more. I see Reverend fighting from his wheelchair. But you're right, there is something. I mean, because I think of Diane Nash Bevel and Reverend James Bevel going from door to door. And they said, okay, if your parents ain't gonna do it to children, do you think it's right not to be free? Mm-hmm. Come with me.
A student at the time, Diane Nash was a student at the time. Mm-hmm. Bevel was a student at the time. SNCC was students. These were young people, teenagers, who had enough gumption to get up and fight for themselves.
Well, I you know, if I can weigh in there, you know, I hear the argument that's being waged, you know, against towns like New Bern, but let me raise this. There's also an economic reality that's also there for their existence. A lot of times in a lot of these small towns, they're looking at providing for their families. And they realize that if they strike back, if they stand up, Dwight, as you're laying out, as they should, that there's an economic reality that could impact their entire family, and they want to be able to feed their families. And the businesses that are there that are owned and where they work are owned by white people, and those people will not allow them to continue to strike back, as you're saying. A similar situation existed in Brunswick, where Ahmaud Arbery was killed
in Georgia.
In Georgia, was gunned down. It was the same type of atmosphere that was created. It was one where, you know, black folks, black citizens there were not full citizens. Okay, didn't believe they could exercise all of their rights, and all of, you know, and that type of mindset that is being pushed and forced upon them politically. So, you know, it's not necessarily just that they don't want to rise up, but I think there's also sometimes an economic reality that's there for them that stands up to say that if I do, my family's going to suffer. That's why, as you were laying out, Dwight, that you had a lot of high school students that were participating in the marches, because they had not, you know, they didn't have the economic pieces to it, the impact from them from participating in the march. Their families did, and their families oftentimes would not want them to participate if they thought it was going to impact the family overall. But I think that's, you know, part of the perspective, and that occurs even in the Eastern Shore of Maryland today. Politically, that mindset still exists, that fear still exists, that concern still exists. So it's not just New Bern. I think it's all over the country that you'll find these predominantly smaller towns where this occurs.
Doc, most of the women that marched in Montgomery work for the white women in town.
Yeah,
they made a movie about it called The Help. Most of them who in the march, they literally worked in the houses of the white people that who told them, if you get in that march, you will not be able to work here anymore. And they said your loss will be bigger than my loss, because you need me more than I need you. And part of the people off the record that helped settle that situation was those white housewives who couldn't operate without the help. And they told their husbands, you better settle this, because I ain't washing no clothes and I don't know how to cook. So you need to work this out. So anybody who says, and I believe what you say is true, that their primary concern is their economic interest, that is probably real, but it's also based on more fear than courage. Because most Black people who end up suffering had to make a choice between their occupation and their preoccupation. between their courage in their jobs and their livelihood. And so somebody like Rosie Parks, who's a seamstress, had to make that choice, and she had to choose between holding her job or going to jail.
Or should just say her occupation or living under occupation.
That's
And
correct.
the song
Well,
says,
yeah, I
if
mean,
I
I think
perish, let me perish. I'm going to meet the king. I mean, because all of our, and that's why I think, Joe, our leaders, you know, we can have a healthy discussion about this. They have inspired us. They put, slaves are not born, they're made. You have to
yeah.
break a person to make a slave. You have to break a person for them to live under occupation. You have to break a person for them to live under Jim Crow. You have to break a person. And so when you look at, excuse me, when you look at a Frederick Douglass, he was here to restore and remake. You know, that is what Malcolm X did. That's what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King did. That's what Reverend Jackson, Keep Hope Alive. These people, they restored us and they said, look, it's an unjust law. I know it's legal, but it's wrong.
Like I said,
And
I firmly believe, you know, and I'm just going to keep saying that we as a people have been disempowered for so long, we no longer know how to wield power. I feel like we need to take a trip back to Civil Rights 101. You know, when Frederick Douglass says that without struggle there is no progress, he wasn't talking about tweets. The revolution will not be televised, and you're certainly not going to secure your freedom. One, you know, tweet at a time on the platform formerly known as Twitter. And so all of this is embedded in the blueprint for how you achieve freedom and justice, which we have at our disposal if we could actually remember it, if we could actually re-internalize it. You know, when A. Philip Randolph is sitting there talking to the president and he says, you have to go out there and make me do it, what do you
FDA,
think he was talking about? When you're listening to, again, those sanitation workers down in Memphis who took off the job to walk around with placards that said, I am a man. What do you think is entailed to ensure freedom? And so, again, as I always go back to that founding ethos for the Black Congressional Caucus, Black people have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And we have made a permanent friend in the Democratic Party. We have made a permanent enemy of the Republican Party. We have acted as if the government is always going to be there to save us with a new program or a new shining white knight that's going to show up in the 11th hour and give us the freedoms that do not come from government but come from God. And all of this has led to what has been a permanent handicap, which has led to sections of our communities being stuck in a permanent underclass. And so, yes, it's very easy to go find an orange man in New York to point at and blame for your problems. It's very easy to go find a political platform and point at and say, here's the problem. And it's very easy, perhaps, for us to sit here on this Zoom or, you know, StreamYard and talk about what people should be doing and sacrificing who have very less than most of us have been blessed with. So it's never easy. It's always going to entail struggle. But I do agree with Brother Dwight, because at some point you get the treatment that you have conditioned people to give you. And we have been conditioning people to believe it is okay to give us less than we deserve, including some people who raise their hands and claim to be the most allied of the allied on our behalf.
well, you know, let me say this. Reverend Jackson has often said, and it's resonated with me, Joe and Dwight and Daryl, Attorney Jones. We don't understand power, Joe, because we were in slavery longer than we've been free. I knew how much of power we didn't understand. That's why Reverend Leon Sullivan said, okay, we got our civil rights. Now we need silver rights. I can sit at the counter of Woolworth, but if I can't afford that quarter hamburger, then we got a problem. So we have to, and so Dr. King started looking at the structural inequalities in the United States of America. This has never been about the Democrats or the Republicans. No, because we have moved from party to party depending upon who advocated best for our interests at the time. I think what we have to understand is that white people are never out. They're Republican and they're Democrat, but they always make the argument for their freedom and emancipation and empowerment. And that is where we have to grow up in our politics. Because plantation politics, I don't play. I don't want to be on any of them. I want to have the freedom and I want some solutions. I mean, inflation is too high. I don't care what White House says, everything's all right. They both said, all the Republicans and Democrats say it's all right. People can't afford groceries. People can't afford rent. They're not able to buy houses. They're not able to send their children to school. And I still don't have the protected right to vote. You are right, Joe. On paper, I got it. But in fact, I don't. So how, when you talk to the Republicans, how do you make them see? Because Republicans write us off, Democrats take us for granted. That still is true. But you still have two parties who support the oligarchy. They ain't supporting any of us. None of them. Ain't no sanctuary nowhere, except in our own decision to move, Joe and Dwight. We're the ones who have to free ourselves. Nobody's going to save us, for us, from anybody else but us. We're the ones, and we're the ones who we always had to wait for. We're the ones, always. And I don't know how we get that twisted, Joseph and Dwight and Daryl Jones. Ain't nobody coming flying down to save us. Nobody. It doesn't work that way. So, so how do you get, what do you say to the people of New Bern? Because I've been in many a New Bern, Joseph. I've been in places where Reverend stood in the middle of a town square in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s and the 2010s and up until he barely could stand past 2024. And many Black people are still living under occupation. But then you had some people who were willing to step out and say you don't need to do that. We have to be there. Period.
I think it's when we demand accountability and when we stop waiting on approval to not just be indignant, but to be proactive in securing our freedoms again, I think things will change. And I think that this extends to many issues, right? We could talk about, as I say here in New York, public housing, where we've gone from being $40 billion behind on repairs to 2 years later, close to $80 billion behind in repairs as the problem begins to metastasize and mushroom. And yet no one says anything. But we can find $40 billion in the couch cushions to send to Ukraine. And that is no disrespect to the needs of the people of Ukraine. But most assuredly, if you can find $40 billion for people that don't live here on 48 hours notice, certainly we should be able to make sure that people in Jackson, Mississippi don't have to take a shower with their mouths closed. So this is all about a systemic neglect permeated throughout the entirety of our politics, because both parties have realized that they don't have to do anything for Black people. Republican Party doesn't really have to do much for Black people because they don't anticipate much Black support. Democratic Party doesn't have to do much for Black people because they know that the Black vote's not going anywhere. And so all they have to do every 4 years is convince enough of us that, like, that play about Annie the Orphan, that the sun will come out tomorrow. But tomorrow always comes, and the pain always remains. And so I think, to Brother Dwight's point, we have to start executing differently. We have to start moving differently. But more importantly, I think it's not a new movement. It's an old movement. The blueprint is there. People see the
Joe?
And read about them.
No, you said the movement is there. I wanted you.
Yeah, the movement is there. The blueprint is there. We just have to, pick up some books, read about them. We just have to talk to some elders, remember what was done, because it's quite easy to see what happens here. We need to go out there in force and demand justice, not think that the Justice Department is going to show up and give you rights that you're already entitled to.
Dwight?
And it's nothing worse than having power and be afraid to use it. I mean, he's already the mayor. He already has the capacity to appoint deputies. These people are in violation of the law. They're lawbreakers. And so you should arrest them and then let the courts respond to that. Let the nation respond to that. because constitutionally, he's in his rights to do that. And so, until you are not afraid of the power that you have been able to accumulate, then you will be in perpetual. No matter what they tell you, you will be in perpetual servitude. It no matter what laws they pass. If you don't believe that you are worthy of, or you don't exercise the power therein, then you always going to be a self-inflicted slave.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this is playing out. Could you imagine if this was reversed and the town was 80% white and 20% of the Negroes decided white folk didn't have the right to vote and started having secret meetings? Chances are some of them would have been lynched by now. I mean, it's a matter of your self-dignity, your self-concept. Where's your insult level?
And I'm not disagreeing with you, Dwight, nor Joe, with regards to what some of the folks in the town have got to have the fortitude, the internal intestinal fortitude to stand up and do. But I will not take away from Patrick Braxton, the guy that decided to run for mayor.
Mm-hmm.
His decision to challenge this system. And he ran to challenge the system. He's now suing through the LDF to challenge the system. He's putting it in place. He's using the structure that the system has given him to now fight the system that was in place. I agree with you wholeheartedly that, if you are a Black person that's in New Bern, Alabama, you need to be right behind Braxton. You need to be in the streets. You need to be doing whatever is necessary to be certain that your voting rights and your rights overall are not being trampled upon. But, I think that it is significant that Mayor Braxton, and I don't think he was ever sworn in. I think that after he won the election, they never swore him in. So he was never sworn in to have the sheriffs and the other availability to the things that you're indicating, which is another legal fight. But I certainly do take a hat off to him for having the guts to put in to run for the mayor, for having the integrity and the fight to be able to file the case, to be able to lift this up so people can see what's happening in New Bern to get it turned around.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that also. And I would just say, again, yes, I think two things can be true at the same time. That people do need to stand up for their rights, but also that we have to acknowledge the economic realities that prohibit some people from getting fully engaged. And I think, again, the problem with a place like this that is so small is that in many ways, you don't have the brute force in numbers to be able to do what sometimes is required. And so, for me, it's almost, again, the broader narrative of, who is a part of the village and who is a part of the community and who is going to take responsibility for being their brother's keeper. If we can take planes, trains, and automobiles to go down to Washington, D.C. and complain about who the president is going to be on Inauguration Day, those same people can take planes, trains, and automobiles down to Alabama and help determine whether or not people that look like them are going to be fully vested American citizens with their rights to vote. And so it's incumbent on all of us, not just the people that live there, but also all the people that will point to there and use that as an example of what's wrong with America. Well, either you want to fix what's wrong with America or you don't. And either you're going to sit here and embrace a kind of victimhood mentality or you're going to do something about it. So we all have to get involved in whatever way we can, whether that's making phone calls to your various people in the federal government, whether that's getting down there to wage protests on the ground. Again, I spend a lot of time on the local cable news. And if I'm not talking about Donald Trump falling asleep in court, or whether Donald Trump rolled out a pair of gold sneakers and how the Black community should feel about either one of those things. And rarely are we talking about these issues with the substance and the depth and the urgency that they clearly deserve, except when it comes time for us to use it as political fodder in order to try to nudge Black people writ large to do what they need to do on behalf of an institution that to this day remains majority comprised of people that don't look like us. That's on both sides of the aisle, but certainly still exists in many ways on the Democratic side as well.
Well, but skin ain't kin, right? And I'm hearing you. The fact is, you have. My thing is, which side are you on? Which side are you on? That was an old movement song. Are you on the side of justice or not? Are you on the side of liberty or not? Are you on the side of freedom or not? Where are you? And I think that's the question that we have to ask and answer. And as you say, Joe, Dwight, Daryl, put your body in it. We all have skin in this game. And if our brothers and sisters down in New Bern are feeling dispirited, are feeling broken, and being fearful, because I have literally seen it. I've been to so many of these places where people are broken and they are literally afraid to come out. And please, Herschel Walker is part of that tradition. There was a big protest 40 odd years ago before he went to University of Georgia. Mrs. King, Mrs. Coretta King, Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Joseph Lowery, and all of these big Black leaders asked him to side with Black people, side with your people in this protest. And his family steadfastly refused to be involved because they were good Black folks. And those people keep us in chains. And, so I think that, Dwight, you did a reset in terms of the thinking, because it's like, wait a minute, because you grew up under the people and you grew up with the people who said, wait, you can't take this. So why? Because you had such a strong reaction to this particular case. Why, Dwight?
Well, like you said, I grew up in this. It ain't no mystery to me. When I was in high school, we went to a 90% white high school. It was in West Pullman, where all the old Pullman guys used to work.
In Chicago.
In Chicago, all the ethnics worked that came out of Pullman Company, George Pullman.
I got 4 minutes.
And when I was in school was 90%, was Finger High School back then, 90% white. And administration was almost all white. And then when I first started, it was all white. I think we had maybe one Black teacher. And sisters came to us one day. We was on the basketball team and said, we've noticed that we could never have a Black cheerleader. All the cheerleaders have to be white and blonde in this world. And we really would like to be cheerleaders. If y'all playing basketball, we like to cheer for you all. Can you help us? And we said, and we wasn't but 7% of the population of the school. We said, okay, tell you what, we remember this to say either cut us in, as your daddy would have said, or cut it out. And in high school, we closed down the school. They put me in jail. They stopped me from graduating. They put glass in my food. They did everything they could do to discourage me and my crowd from taking a position. The police came in and beat us. Anybody over 5'3", they arrested so the white boys could run rampant with all of the short, smaller kids. And we never stopped. It's until we got what we wanted. And I left there and got involved. And I was a sophomore and got involved in Breadbasket because I saw in Breadbasket that same mentality. That Dr. King and them were going to be undaunted. That Jesse Jackson was going to be undaunted. And so I got involved in that because that was my kind of crowd. You have to bring your courage with you. You can't wait for somebody to fight your fight. You got to fight your own fight and have people join you in your fight. And that's where we seem to have lost as a people. When I was growing up, it was almost standard. Now, this complacency in this fear is standard. And I really don't know where it went. Back in my day, we used to wake up in the morning and say, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. keep on walking, keep on talking. We sing freedom songs. We learn freedom songs. Now we don't even know a freedom song because freedom is not on our mind. One of the songs we sing is, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Now our minds stay on comfortability and stay on security. And we're afraid to exercise the dignity that God has called us to represent. And I don't understand how we got that way. I really don't.
Literally inside of a minute, Joe Pinion, your closing thought.
You can't ride the back of an upright man. And so we have to start operating as people who remember that our spine is not crooked, and that everything that exists in this country exists because of sacrifices of people that look like us. And so that does not mean that we take to the streets and tear it up, but it does mean that we can take to the streets to create awareness around the fact that our behinds have been left behind by people who claim that they are not the evil monsters in the stories that have been told about them. So that's my closing thought. Again, grateful to have the conversation. But the cavalry is not coming to save us. Justice is not coming to save us from the Department of Justice. We are our own cavalry. We will sink or swim together as a community when we stop trying to figure out who to blame and start trying to focus squarely on solving the problem.
Daryl Jones, under a minute.
Under a minute, Santita. I encourage everybody. I say every Tuesday on WOL when I close out my show to get off the sidewalks and to get in the streets. And what I mean by that is that you can't be on the sidewalk observing what's happening around you. You got to be in the street. You got to be a part of it. You got to get in there and be certain that you're in the election. You're in the political person's face. Right now, it's most important that you contact your elected officials. Tell them that you want President Biden to sign that executive order for voting rights so that we can try to prevent another New Bern from happening in the United States. Folks, it's that time, Santita. It's that time. Get off the sidewalks, get in the streets, and let's make it happen.
And know that you're God's child. You are somebody. You are somebody. And you do not deserve to be treated this way. But you're the one who has to make that decision. You can't wait for someone to treat you well. You're the one. You teach people how to treat you. And when Black people decided that they had had enough in Montgomery, Alabama, things changed. When we changed our minds in Selma, things changed. When we changed our mind about slavery, as quiet as it's kept, white slaveholders were too afraid to keep us with them. Martha Washington, George Washington's wife, didn't even want the slaves that he was leaving to her. He said, they don't like me. She said that. She said, hey, this was years, almost a century before slavery ended. Because she saw something. Now be something. Everybody, let's keep each other encouraged and know that freedom is not something people give to you. You have to take it. You have to fight to keep it. It's really that simple. I'm Santita Jackson, Joe Pinion. Can't wait to see you again on CNN. You're always saying something that makes some sense. Dwight McKee, always love having you. Daryl Jones on WOL out of Washington, D.C., 12 noon Eastern Standard Time every Tuesday with Barbara Arnwine. I'm Santita Jackson. God bless.